will be talking about sociology and decolonization today. Sociology and decolonization are interconnected fields. They examine the social, the cultural, the political dynamics of colonization, its impacts on societies, and the process of undoing colonial structures and mindsets. Now, sociology as a discipline analyzes social relations, institutions, institutional systems within societies. And decolonization refers to the dismantling of colonial legacies and power structures. During this lecture, our objectives will be to know what is decolonization, decolonialism and post-colonialism. We will then try to relate decolonialism to modernity, after which we will try and understand what does decolonialism really entail, as in what is the point of decolonialism, what do we have to do to decolonize the society, the knowledge structures, etc. And lastly, to sort of wrap up, we will try and see what is sociology's contribution to decolonizing the knowledge systems. So what is decolonialism? Decolonialism is a very new concept that emerged in the 20th century. Gradually, as previously colonized countries started gaining their independence from imperial empires that had ruled them for a considerable period of time, the concept of post-colonial, decolonial started emerging. The 19th century witnessed independence movements of the Latin American countries, which were soon followed by other colonized nations in Asia, in Africa, etc. The changes in history were exacerbated. That is, say, in the span of around 20 years, from 1945 to 1965, almost 75 countries had gained their independence from the colonial powers. Now, the process of gaining the independence was either extremely violent, say, for instance, in Congo or Ivory Coast, or relatively peaceful. There are various examples where certain amendments were made and certain international organizations played together to gain independence for certain smaller nations in Africa. But however different the kind of colonialism that was experienced by these different countries, the impact of colonialism were very similar. The term decolonization is intertwined with various other conceptualizations, such as post-colonial, post-modern, which are equally difficult to define. Now, in order to understand what decolonialism entails, we can understand decolonialism in two ways, either as a historical concept or a conceptual concept. Now, as a historical concept, decolonialism may either be an event or a process. An event would be the exact opportune moment when the colonial countries gained their independence, and the process would entail the entire movement for independence that these countries went through. Now, Robert de la Vignette, he was a French colonial administrator. He wrote, while describing all these independence movements that happened one after the other, that they shot up like volcanic lava. Now, this metaphor is very opportune because the brewing acrimony, the brewing tensions, the brewing anger that these colonies felt against the empires were very important in the post-colonial fashioning of these countries and how they felt about themselves as independent and free countries. When we look at colonialism as a process, we also need to look at decolonialism as a process. Now, there were two ways in which decolonization was being talked about by scholars at that point of time. One was that there was a certain voluntary retreat by the imperial empires, that they did not want to be in the colonies anymore for two reasons, either because of a moral obligation that they had done enough and they were now supposed to leave because their civilizing mission was complete, or because there was nothing else to gain from these colonies. They had already drained all the resources that were available, and they had shipped it back home, so there was nothing more to gain. So they were gradually retreating. Now, the problem with both these approaches, whether we take a positive approach or a negative approach toward the imperial empire, the problem with both these approaches is that they invisibilize the political struggle that all these colonial countries went through in trying to gain their independence. So we continuously use the term gain to highlight that struggle, to highlight that entire movement, armed struggle, or the non-cooperation movement in India, for instance, which was non-violent yet extremely strong. The third way in which we can look at decolonialism is in a way of restorative justice for the colonies. Now, this is where academia also come in. That is, how is knowledge produced in the colonies? What are the ways in which we understand the colonial structures? What are the ways in which we try to fight them? This is a third way of looking at decolonialism. What kind of restorative justice are we providing to these people who had absolutely no power to, on their own lives, on their own countries? They had no rights, no duties, etc. Therefore, to discuss this, we will discuss decolonialism and post-colonialism. That is, what happened after the ruler was thwarted or the ruler went away. Now, the newly formed nations had a huge task ahead of them. They had to now establish themselves in global politics, find their footing as independent countries who were capable of managing their own affairs. They soon realized that the centuries-long effect of being subjects who were rendered with no power to take any administrative or political decisions for themselves was massive, and the struggle was not over with merely gaining the status of independence. Now, the undoing of colonialism had already started with the various changes which were primarily political but not limited to the political issues. Now, what were the political issues that were changing in these post-colonial nations? Transnational empires were now replaced by independent nation states. The concept of nation states came into being with specific territorial boundaries, which were now self-administrative units. The political status of the imperial subjects had also changed. They were now identified as citizens and not subjects. They had rights to enjoy, duties to perform. Liberty was now entwined with an egalitarian value, where diversities were being recognized, diversities were being celebrated. It was maintained that people were different, but these differences had no hierarchy, especially no racial hierarchy. International laws were passed to initiate restoring the post-colonial nations through promoting education, strengthening healthcare, strengthening medical facilities, etc. A peaceful environment was promised through the passing of other kinds of international laws, whereby armed territorial conquest was criminalized. So you could not just go and take over another territory. Yet, the difficulty of overcoming centuries of domination and debilitation was enormous. The newly independent nations across the world identified that although they had different kinds of rulers, different kinds of systems of rule, but the impact of colonialism that all of them felt was very similar. Their tribulations were similar, their trials were similar, and these kinds of sympathetic understanding of each other's problems led to certain international sitting-togethers. So in 1955, 29 post-colonial nations met at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, where they discussed the principles of political self-determination, mutual respect for sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in internal affairs, and all of them, at the close of the ceremony, all of them signed a communique. that included a range of very concrete objectives, that they would promote economic cooperation, cultural cooperation, protection of human rights, principle of self-determination. There was a call for an end to racial discrimination wherever it occurred, and a reiteration of the importance of peaceful coexistence. This conference was extremely important because it was made of people who were all from post-colonial nations. It had created the new third world. Now, this was a time of the Cold War. From the late 1940s till the late 1980s, the Cold War was on, and the world was divided into the capitalist first world and the communist second world, or Soviet second world. This was a creation of a non-aligned third world. The third world who decided that I am not going to align with either of the parties, and I am going to start peaceful coexistence with everyone for my own economic development. Very soon, the term third world was being replaced because the term third world was not value neutral. The term third world was replaced by the term global south by Raven Cornell. The global south and the global north were interconnected, of course, in the way that they were interacting, but the global south now had an identity of its own. It was not just a subject of the north. Now, post-coloniality, of course, refers to a historical period, because these countries were establishing their political, their administrative, and their economic units. But the impact of colonialism was visible enough to claim that most of these nations were imitating the existing imperial models in how they were structuring their state institutions, their ministries, parliaments, governing bodies, their schools, their hospitals. This modeling also extended to how knowledge was being produced into the academia. Scholars such as Farid Alatas or Ashish Nandi spoke of the captive mind, that the colonizers had not only captured the physical space but also the mind of the people, and therefore they could not get out of a Western lens. They were viewing everything with a Western lens, with Western subjectivities, with Western epistemologies. Therefore, what was required was really an epistemic shift, which we will speak of. See, development itself had a Western origin. Development was Western. Development was connected to the idea of modernity. Development could only happen in stages. So we have to discuss decolonization and modernity to see whether development in the third world was even possible without the help of the West. Now, the project of modernity claimed that all societies progress through similar stages of development. So there is a linear view of development, whereby today's developed areas were in a situation that is similar to that which is faced by the underdeveloped areas. Therefore, growth in these areas could only be accelerated through that supposed common path of development. So the president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, that is how we pronounce his name, but in English you can also call it Nkrumah. The president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, called this neo-colonialism. That is, this was a new kind of colonialism. Neo-colonialism helped the erstwhile colonial powers could maintain their dominance through interfering in the affairs of the post-colonial nations through investments, through technology transfers, through constant competition in the world market. The creation of a global interconnected economy where all nations were given the impression that they were operating in a free market was far from the truth. Immanuel Wallerstein created his world systems theory, which demonstrated that the world is indeed working on the interdependence of two regions, and he classified them as the core and the periphery. These are geographically and culturally different. one focusing on labor-intensive and other on capital-intensive production. So most of the Western countries that were already established had enough capital, they were economically superior to the other nations. They formed the core. The rest of the nations, post-colonial nations, who were only trying to develop right now, their development had just started, formed the periphery. What the core did was, the core extracted raw materials, resources, and cheap labor from the periphery. The development of the core, therefore, was dependent on the underdevelopment of the periphery. The core exploited the periphery in various other ways. The periphery also acted as a market for all the manufactured goods and finished products of the core. Therefore, the core was profiting consistently and continuously more than the peripheral countries. And the peripheral countries had little bargaining power in the face of the huge conglomerates that they were facing. It was almost impossible to take part in the free market with their indigenous products that were neither cheaply manufactured nor were they advertised enough. Thus, they were rendered as a labor market, where education and skills only targeted at preparing the citizens to serve the interests of the capitalist global market. The trap of neocolonialism was harder to break than that of colonialism. Thus, decolonizing now meant that an alternative path had to be created for these post-colonial nations that did not consider themselves to be just primitive versions of the developed nations. Decolonization scholars claimed that the development of the first world could only be possible if the third world kept underdeveloping, right? Because they were extracting cheap resources and labor from the third world. So this advancement was disadvantaging the rest of the world. The dependency theorists, as they are called, because they talk about how the development is dependent on underdevelopment, they claimed, in opposition to the free market economists, therefore, that underdeveloped countries now need to reduce their connectedness. We do not require so much of globalism. Globalism has its own problems, so we need to reduce our connectedness with the world market and pursue our own path, keeping with our own needs, less dictated by external pressures. We need to create an indigenous path of development based on indigenous knowledge structures. Therefore, now decolonialism was a project. Something had to be done. So what does decolonialism entail? The undoing of colonialism in the political and economic sectors was only possible if there was a shift in the ways that knowledge was produced in these countries. Globalism is, of course, about inclusivity, but this inclusivity comes with hierarchies. Okay? Global citizenship is a part of the rhetoric of modernity. Salvation, development, progress, well-being for all, democracy, whereas the imperial and colonial differences are the invisible divides that maintain the logic of coloniality. What is the logic of coloniality? Oppression, domination, exploitation, marginalization. The history of the world is often fashioned according to the history of the West. So we usually, even when we start studying sociology, we start with the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. But none of these revolutions really took place in India, right? So why do we keep talking about these as historic events, but not really the independence movement as a historic event, unless we are talking of Indian sociology? So all our canonical texts are also Western. These events, the effects of these events, were limited to those spaces. Therefore, we need to provincialize these theories. Now, when Dipesh Chakraborty wrote Provincializing Europe, and he talked about how certain events and their impacts need to be understood only in the context of the space in which they developed, Chakraborty also said that Europe, that is constantly mentioned in these knowledge structures, in these conceptualizations, these concepts that developed in Europe, Europe here is not really a physical space. It is an imaginary figure that remains deeply embedded in cliched and shorthand forms in some everyday habits of thought that invariably subtend attempts in the social sciences to address questions of political modernity in South Asia. This is directly from Chakraborty. Chakraborty claims that this Europe is only in the minds of the colonizers as well as the colonized. And this Europe needs to be ousted, because this is not really a physical space. We are just talking about certain conceptualizations. Decolonization, therefore, requires an epistemic shift. We need to create concepts, we need to create categories through which we can understand our space through our own indigenous lens. Epistemic decolonization recognizes that it is important to consider diverse knowledge traditions, and we need to decenter Western knowledge. Western knowledge should not be universalized. It is not a universal standard. It is one among the many. Now, disciplines such as anthropology and sociology are also cohorts in this process of maintaining the hegemony of Western knowledge production. Anthropology. Anthropology supported the logic of colonialism by maintaining the binaries of primitive and modern, savage and civilized. So in the context of colonialism, anthropology was employed by colonial powers to understand and categorize the societies they encountered. Now, this is a very brief understanding. If we go into a detailed study, we will find scholars such as Johannes Fabian or Partho Chatterjee talks about all of this in detail in how anthropology talks about time as if the primitive lives in a separate time than the anthropologist who comes from a civilized world. So when you call someone primitive, you immediately consider that person to live in a different time zone than yours, which is not true. You are both together, which is why the ethnography or the fieldwork can be conducted. So it is a fascinating theory. The information that the anthropologists collected were actually used to exert control over colonized populations, because knowledge is power. It justified the colonial policies. It established the hierarchies of racial and cultural superiority. Same with sociology, as we discussed. The canonical texts were all based on events that had happened in Europe. So if we use Durkheim's idea of suicide and we universalize it and we try to understand it in the context of India, it may not be directly implantable here. Right? We need to understand the context, the historical period of when that particular fieldwork was conducted, and then look at the indigenous scene from its own perspective, through its own lens. Decolonization thus calls for the establishment of indigenous and native studies that would focus on the experiences, the cultures, and the knowledges, if I may, of indigenous peoples. These theories emphasize the importance of decolonizing land, resources, governance, and cultural practices. Indigenous and native studies challenge the ongoing colonization of indigenous rights and sovereignty. Border thinking is another concept that comes with decolonizing academia. Walter Mignolo spoke of border thinking, and he critiques binary thinking. He challenges the divisions that were created by colonial borders and colonial hierarchies. He seeks to decolonize knowledge production by transcending Eurocentric frameworks, and he wants to embrace multiple epistemologies and perspectives. Border thinking encourages dialogue, mutual learning, recognition of diverse knowledge traditions, border thinking is important because border thinking does not say that we should leave all connections with the West. It says that interactions with the West is necessary, but on equal standing, where all theories will interact with each other as equals. Indigenizing knowledge production was seen as a way not only to chalk out an alternative way of development, but also critique the romanticized Orientalist depiction that Edward Said speaks of. There is a very romanticized version of the rest of the world. Say India has the romanticized version of being a land of the snake charmers, of being mystical. There are still people who come here only to find themselves and do yoga. So there is a certain way, and the development that the country is actually going through is obfuscated in the face of this spirituality and romantic image of India. So border thinking will also help us to question all these imageries that are produced in the West of the non-West. Now, what is sociology's contribution to decolonization? So we come to the last part, we come to the conclusion where we talk about how does sociology contribute in this entire process of decolonization. Sociology can provide insights into the ways in which colonialism shapes social structures, hierarchies, injustices, inequalities within the colonized societies. It examines how the colonial powers create and maintain systems of oppression, such as racism, economic exploitation, cultural marginalization, and political subjugation. If you look at India, at the Indian context, you will be able to understand how certain inequalities that persist in the country, which sociology tries to look at, which sociology tries to unearth, are vestiges of colonialism. Decolonization, on the other hand, it refers to the process of challenging, dismantling these colonial structures. So we start with sociology, where we highlight, and we go into a sociological decolonization where we try to dismantle these colonial structures and reclaim indigenous knowledge, promote self-determination, address the legacies of colonialism. Sociology plays a very crucial role in understanding the mechanisms and the impacts of decolonization. It examines social movements, resistance, activism that is aimed at challenging colonial power dynamics, promoting social justice, advocating for the rights and autonomy of colonized peoples. Thirdly, sociology also contributes to the understanding of decolonization by exploring more layered concepts like power, privilege, identity, intersectionality. It helps to uncover the underlying social, cultural, and economic factors that perpetuate colonialism and provide frameworks for critically analyzing and challenging these dynamics. For instance, when you study gender, if you look at the Western knowledge structures, it is just the man and the woman. But the moment you bring gender studies into the post-colonial nations, then it is the colonizer, the man, the colonized man, and the colonized woman. So the power structure and the identities become very different. And these layers can be highlighted by sociology in order to decolonize, in order to break these structures. We need to first highlight them, we need to first study them, and that task is performed by sociology. Sociology can also inform decolonization by highlighting the importance of dialogue, collaboration, participation. It emphasizes the need to center the experiences and knowledge of colonized communities. It engages them in decision-making processes and recognizes their agency and expertise. So when you examine social institutions through a decolonial lens, sociology contributes to creating alternative visions of society that would challenge colonial hierarchies, and it would promote social justice. So to summarize, when we look at sociology and decolonization together, they are deeply intertwined. Sociology would provide the tools, sociology would provide the indigenous theories, the frameworks to understand the social dynamics of colonialism and its impacts on societies. It can also show ways in which decolonization might be possible. Right? It uncovers the colonial structures for them to be targeted. By critically analyzing and deconstructing those systems, sociology contributes to the broader project of decolonization. Sociology tries to create more equitable and just societies by promising to indigenize the knowledge structures, to create theories from the lens of the indigenous and the endogenous citizen. Thank you.